Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Elephant TV. My name is Joko Buthi. Today, I'll be speaking to Maren Mantovani. Maren is International Outreach Coordinator of Stop the War campaign with the BDS Movement. Welcome, Maren, to the Elephant TV.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you for this short time.
Okay, great. Just to start this conversation, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of traction around the BDS movement in Palestine and why the BDS movement is doing what it's doing. But for the sake of our audience, if you could just briefly, what is the BDS movement and why does it exist?
Well, the BDS movement, BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And it is born in 2005 from a united Palestinian call upon people across the world to unite and work towards boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, BDS. This 2005 call actually comes and has its roots in the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in 2001, where civil society from across the world came together and not only defined Israel as an apartheid regime and denounced its apartheid policies, but as well for the first time called for the boycott of Israel. The BDS movement is then, over the years, developed to that call in 2005. And from then on, really, it went global. And I guess when talking about the BDS movement, there are a few things important to highlight beyond the list of victories and successes that we've had. And I guess the first impact that the BDS movement has had is that it completely shifted discourse and action around Palestine. I remember the times before 2005 when we were meeting and we had conferences and we had film screenings and we would see the horrible situation in Palestine, the dramatic human rights violations by Israel every day. And I always said it was some kind of self-induced depression session because we didn't really know what to do. And then comes this call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And all of a sudden, we can end our meetings not on a negative note, lamenting, and we still need to continue to lament the tragic loss of life, the tragic situation in Palestine. But at the same time, we have something concrete to do. We have something concrete to do in order to change the way we and our organizations work, in order to pressure our governments, pressure our institutions to stop supporting Israeli apartheid. Because the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions really has three levels. The first one, the boycott level, which is on the one hand, the consumer boycott. It's about ensuring not to buy products that are involved or produced within the Israeli apartheid regime, or to join boycott campaigns, like, for example, the current boycott campaign around Puma, the sports gear company, which is sponsoring the Israeli National Football Association, which includes, among others as well, all the football clubs from the settlements. And to be able as an individual and as a consumer to join action with so many others and actually pressure big multinational companies to change their behavior and stop supporting Israeli apartheid. The second level, then the divestment level, which is very much an effort being done by institutions, churches, universities to divest their funds from companies that are involved with Israeli apartheid. And then the third level, evidently, the sanctions, trying to get our governments to change course and hold Israel accountable for its human rights violations. Fundamentally, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is rooted in the anti-apartheid struggle of the African people that have already, long before the Palestinian people, taken up that tool of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the boycott movement against the erstwhile South African apartheid regime. And it has shown to be an effective tool in overcoming apartheid. Because I think the important part here is that for Palestinians, that African struggle against apartheid is not only an inspiration as a model of work and of struggle, but as well an inspiration of hope. And because you have overcome apartheid on the African continent. So that shows it is possible to win and to achieve as well justice in Palestine. If we could do it with South Africa, why can't we do it with Palestine?
Right. You mentioned there when talking about BDS that the collection of civil society groups, not just in Palestine but across the world, came together and defined and said that Israel is actually an apartheid state, and for me listening to you as a Kenyan here, and the narratives, particularly because Kenya and Israel have been allies for a long time. As I mentioned to you earlier, Kenya is 80% Christian, 23% of these evangelical Christians. And the narrative that Kenyans, and in large part also East Africans, also Nigerians, because of just the import of this particular kind of Christianity, the narrative is that the nation of Israel today is actually part of God's kingdom, and they are reclaiming their land, and this is just a prevalent narrative in Kenya, as I told you earlier, because it's a Christian nation, around this issue. But someone who's in the BDS movement, someone who has been talking about this, what actually is the historical context in which the current Israel state came about? What is it, and is there any link between that and what Christians who make part of the larger part of the leadership of in this region? Is there any connection to this narrative?
Well, the connection is there in the sense that, unfortunately, religion is being used in this case to justify injustice. Right. But I think it's important to understand that the real reasons and the real background of what is happening in Palestine is fundamentally European colonialism. The Zionist movement and the idea of the creation of the State of Israel is born within the framework of 19th century European colonialism. The very mere idea that there should be somewhere around the world land without people, for people without land, and complete dehumanizing, de-recognizing of the Palestinian people that were living in Palestine. Right. And the idea that then when the British colonial empire comes and embraces Zionism and the idea to create the State of Israel, to give that homeland there, that wasn't based on any religious idea. When Balfour said that in 1917, that was an understanding that the British Empire had a problem of overstretch already at that time, and that the idea to have a proxy regime within the Middle East was a very useful tool to have. And after the Second World War, when Israel really is established by a United Nations vote, it comes evidently on the backdrop of dramatic and horrific Holocaust and centuries of European, not Palestinian, not Arab, not Middle Eastern, but European Christian anti-Semitism. Right. That has culminated in the dramatic and horrific genocide of the Holocaust. Right. But the interests, the political interests that stood at that time, since 1917 and until today, behind support for Israel is a fundamental colonial interest of having a proxy state there in the heart of the Arab world, at the corner, at the crossing between Europe, Africa, and Asia, to control. And the Palestinians, their basic human rights for self-determination, their basic rights have just simply been ignored, like the rights of any other non-white people have simply been ignored by the colonial powers that be, and that at the time when Israel was created have had the large majority in the United Nations.
Right.
In fact, one sees, and I think that's the important part as well, what happens when the colonized nations, and especially in Africa, gain independence.
Right.
Where does the natural alliance lie? When the Palestinian Liberation Organization is created in the 60s,
right.
The natural allies were in the global south, were in Africa. The liberation struggles of the African people from South Africa to up north, they were all directly connected, interconnected in a mutual solidarity and assistance with the Palestinian people, because there was an understanding that that is a common anti-colonial struggle. So in that sense, religion really has nothing to do with the real interests that are behind especially Western support for Israel. Unfortunately, religion is being used to justify, and it's not only the case of Palestine. Religion, unfortunately, has been used throughout history to justify injustice and to justify colonization. From the very first colonial attempts and conquests of the Spaniards and the Portuguese and then the British and the French, you have the Catholic Church being used to justify. If we go to South Africa, to justify the South African apartheid regime, we had the Christian churches justifying South Africa as some kind of promised land. And we're seeing that once again. But the question in the case of Palestine, that we have an evangelical Christianity that is defining some kind of promised land.
Right.
But I guess while Christianity and religion can play a really important role in actually bringing us to a theology of liberation and bringing us to ethical and behavior and struggles and movements for justice, it is important as well to understand that we cannot build our politics and our vision of the world on books and religions that may be valid for one and not for the other. The question here where we can actually come together is the question of human rights and universal equality and humanity for all that needs to be recognized for all.
Then, Maren, my question is, last couple of early this year, there was a human rights report that was launched, detailing the human rights violations in Palestine, and we have seen a lot of media mentions, a lot of advocacy around it. So my question is that why is it still, even despite of evidence on the face of what's happening in Palestine, America and the European superpowers, why are they still supporting Israel?
I guess that brings us back to the ongoing colonial relations here. And I just wanted to mention, yes, Human Rights Watch has brought out that important, groundbreaking report on apartheid, the apartheid regime of the of the Israeli state against the Palestinian people, but they weren't the first ones. Palestinians have been saying that since a long time. South Africans have been saying that since a long time. Many of us have been saying that since a long time, the United Nations as well. So really, what is so groundbreaking is that even an organization like Human Rights Watch is joining us now in that one. Why has it taken them so long? Why it takes many so long is a question as well of very basic interests. And I think there it is very interesting to see where Israel stands in today's global politics. And if you look at the ones that are the best friends and partners of Israel today across the globe, and we can start from Asia with India and Modi's right-wing Hindutva fascist government that is trying to transform India's democracy in an ethnocratic regime. Then we can go to the dictatorships in the Arab world, movie that have just started up to show openly their relations. Then we go to Europe and the extreme right-wing fascist Orbans and so on. We go to Latin America, we have Bolsonaro in Brazil, and evidently Trump and the whole Trumpism, extreme right supremacist trends in the US. Those all are Israel's best friends and declared best friends. There is a common line between those that are standing with this idea and thriving on the idea of supremacy, of discrimination, of exclusion. And they evidently see in Israel a model of paradigm, of ideology, of methodology, and of technology that they are importing to their own countries. Right. I guess the walls are probably the best expression of that one.
Yeah, speaking on that, I mean, just before you go into that, because you write a good piece and you talk about the politics of walls, right, and how Israel as an apartheid colonial state is an experimental model of where all these countries come and learn many things. You connect Trump's Mexico wall with what Israel has been doing in Palestine. We've been seeing also militarization of the state, the exporting of military equipment from Israel to other parts of the world. And you tie it with this idea of the politics of war. So if you could just tie all this together with what you've been saying around Israel as an experimental center for these fascist powers, but it's the model and logic of its colonialism. If we just tie this for our audience, it would be really good.
Yeah, I guess what is really interesting, and here looking a bit at the last 15, 20 years, when Israel started in 2002, building 8-meter high, 600 kilometers long cement wall across the West Bank and surrounding Palestinian villages and communities, and stealing Palestinian land, stealing Palestinian water, and literally transforming where Palestinians are still living into Bantustans or ghettos. While I think we shouldn't have a conversation without reminding everybody that over half of the Palestinian people is already expelled since 1948, since the creation of the start of Israel, and living as refugees, either in refugee camps in their own land or in exile. But those that were still on their land now are encircled by this 8-meter high wall. Right. And at the beginning, I remember we were telling the world Israel is building an 8-meter high wall, 600 kilometers, and people were just not believing it. We needed to show photos for people to actually believe it. Then we have the ICJ decision, the decision of the International Court of Justice that says the wall is illegal, needs to be torn down, and the international community has an obligation to ensure that it does not aid and assist, but on the contrary, works to ensure that those human rights violations and violations of international law by Israel end. That was 2004. Now, jump to 2021, we have more walls than ever before in history. So what really has happened that the international community, instead of ensuring that Israel's apartheid wall is being torn down, has actually taken and used it as a model to build their own walls. I mean, it's not me making the connection between the US wall on the Mexican border and Israel. It's really Trump himself said that the inspiration came from there. So we always need to say that as well, Trump didn't invent the wall. It was already there. He just made it an electoral campain. And it isn't only the rhetoric, i.e. the kind of paradigm that comes from Israel, as I said. In that case, it is really the technology that is coming, because Elbit Systems, the very company that is building the technology for Israel's apartheid wall, is as well building the wall at the US-Mexican border. And we see the same thing with Europe, that has over 1,000 kilometers of walls against migrants already, and is using, again, Israeli drones from Elbit Systems and other Israeli military companies to build up its surveillance structure against migrants. And I think what is interesting when we're talking about how Israel is exporting its technology around the world, then we need to see that how these military relations are actually structured. Because very often we're talking about the US and its huge military support and military funding to Israel, which is absolutely true, and it should stop now. And lots of people are struggling against it. Right. But what we need to understand is that Israel's military industry is not financed by the US. The US is financing its own military industry to send weapons to Israel. Israel's military industry, and that's the core part of Israel's military economy, of Israel's economy itself, i.e. who sustains Israel's apartheid economy and the illegal occupation in Palestine and the colonialism, are those that are buying those weapons. Who's buying those weapons? It's not the Europeans, it's not the North Americans. We're having our own weapons. It is the global South. Those weapons, those Israeli weapons, go to Latin America, go to Africa, and go to Asia. And what are those weapons doing there? They're fueling the wars that are very often other proxy wars for other colonial interests, and they're undermining democracy within Africa. When we're especially looking at the case of Pegasus, for example, right, where it came out, and Pegasus is only one of the cyber weapons that are around here in Africa. Africa is a huge market for Israeli cyber weapons, espionage, and military. And the real interesting point is when we see what Israel is calling the coming back to Israel, right, this flurry of diplomatic efforts of Israel in various African states and meetings. All these meetings include the representatives of the various companies of military and security equipment. And if we look, when Netanyahu, or one of the Israeli ministers, are coming to Africa, what are they leaving afterwards? They say they leave cooperation and make the desert bloom. Apart from the fact that in the 21st century, we shouldn't try to make the desert bloom anymore. Right. But what they're really leaving, what they're not saying, but what they're really leaving behind is weapons, surveillance mechanisms, and systems to manipulate electoral campaigns. And that is very, very dangerous, not only for the Palestinian people, because it props up the Israeli apartheid system, but directly for the people in Africa and for democracy and justice in Africa.
Okay. I mean, I like how you've tied the ideas of, the military weapons moving from, Israel to the global south, and then they're being used by other colonialists to, to fund proxy wars for the extraction of resources. So, I mean, it's in finally, as we're concluding this conversation, Marina, what's the role of Africa in aiding, but also to break these colonial metrics of power, which you're actually describing? Because it's not really, it's not really, as you're talking about, it's not really what's happening in Israel and Palestine only, but this interconnection within the global south and the rest of the world, that Africa has a significant role to play in destroying and fragmenting and actually exposing these colonial metrics of power that Israel is actually a part of. And within of course, the Israeli state is, of course, the plight and suffering of many Palestinians. Why does Africa, and of course Kenya, this part of Africa, what's its role in this moment in history to try and expose this, but also to disentangle from these colonial metrics of power that Israel and European nations and the West are in cahoots together? And of course, African leaders as part of that.
In effect, I guess the last 20 years have shown, and the experiment of Palestinians with the so-called Oslo process of negotiations, where Europeans were supposed to have a key role in it, has shown that was a complete failure. Europe has predictably, evidently failed Palestinians because of their vested interests in the continuous colonization of Palestine and the rest of the world. And Palestinians have made a very clear strategic choice in saying where we're going forward now, not only with the boycott, divestment and sanctions, the BDS movement, but as a key underlying international policy decision is we want the world to recognize, investigate Israeli apartheid and hold Israel accountable for its apartheid regime and its violations of Palestinian rights. That means we want to get to the United Nations to get a UN General Assembly resolution against Israeli apartheid, the United Nations to reactivate its anti-apartheid mechanisms, including the Special Committee Against Apartheid, the Center Against Apartheid, and impose the same sanctions, including a military embargo that have been imposed against apartheid when it was happening on the African continent in Southern Africa. And in order to achieve this, we know, and Palestinians know, they need to count on the global South. The votes in the General Assembly are coming from the global South. That is a mathematic calculation, but it is as well a political calculation based on that common struggle that Palestinians have together with the African and global South peoples across the world, from Latin America to Asia. And I guess in this framework, it is fundamental to see that Palestinians are aware of it. Israel is as well aware of it. This is why it has tried really hard to infiltrate African governments and African institutions, and literally to sell back apartheid and bring back apartheid to the African continent. And at the very moment, we are in a crucial moment where only a couple of months ago, the chairman of the African Union has accepted Israel's request to become an observer state in the African Union. We know there is huge opposition to it from all of the SADC countries that have already decided that they are standing firmly against the idea to ask Israel and an apartheid state on the same table of the African Union. Arab states on the northern side of Africa have as well expressed their opposition. And on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of this month, the Executive Council of the African Union will meet and will rediscuss this unilateral decision of the chairman of the African Union, because it simply does not reflect the African Union principles. It does not reflect those principles that hold the Palestinian and the African struggles for justice together. And we hope that justice prevails and the anti-apartheid commitment of the African continent will prevail, and that as well from Eastern Africa and Western Africa, we can find support in this renewed 21st century struggle against apartheid.
Right. And finally, my last question, because we're living in an age of narratives, where narratives are more powerful, seemingly more powerful than guns, because of just what people believe. What should Africans get out of this, Maren? What conversations should they start having, and what clear narratives of their realities in relation to the Israel-Palestinian conflict that they need to start having, and such that we'll to connect the dots and understand what actually is happening in their own spaces in relation to what's happening in the global world together?
Well, I don't think I'm the person to tell Africans what they should discuss, but I can tell you that what I'm hearing Africans already discussing, and what I see that it completely joins in with the Palestinian vision and struggle, and that is the fact that we have a common quest against colonialism and against racism. And when Nelson Mandela said, and I knew that slogan already, that the liberation of South Africa and Africa will not be complete until Palestine is free, it sounded always very good to me. Coming here on the continent, I actually understood what it really means to people, that we cannot overcome colonialism if we accept it to happen in one place of the world. We cannot overcome apartheid if we accept it to happen in one place of the world. It will come back to haunt us. And I think that is the profound message that I'm starting to understand, listening to people here in Africa within that sentence of Nelson Mandela. And I guess from that perspective onwards, the question is really how to develop strategies to liberate Africa, to start with, from Israeli apartheid, and help the Palestinian struggle and the global movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, because the historical, the ethical, and the material importance of Africa within this anti-apartheid struggle is absolutely fundamental. I know that here in Kenya, where we are, people are already starting to declare the coffee shops, their libraries, their spaces as apartheid-free spaces. Boycott campaigns are starting to grow, and pressure as well on governments to not support Israeli apartheid is growing. And I think that's a joint way forward.
Great. Maren, thank you so much for giving us your time here at The Elephant.
Thank you for being here with you.
For this and other Elephant conversations, follow The Elephant on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter at The Elephant. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to The Elephant, also on our YouTube channel by clicking on the link below.